15 years after being locked up for a crime that tore his family apart, Daryl Holmes came home. No reunions. No apologies. Just a family barbecue, and 3 bodies left behind. His mother. His brother. Her new man. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He looked his sister in the eyes, and said, "Call the police. Tell them it was me." But what led up to that moment? Why did a son already branded a killer come back just to destroy what was left? And why, after everything, did he spare just one person? The answers would tear open secrets no one was ready to face. Not then. And definitely not now. Daryl Holmes was born into a home where his presence felt more like a disruption than a celebration. The youngest of 3 children, he carried the reputation of being unpredictable, unstable, and, eventually, unwanted. While his older brother Marcus was known for academic success and discipline, and his sister for her quiet, responsible nature, Daryl stood out for all the wrong reasons. Teachers remembered him as the kid who never stayed seated. Neighbors recalled arguments spilling into the street. By his late teens, he had already cycled through multiple schools, brushes with law enforcement, and a short-lived interest in underground rap that never made it past a few local open mics. He rarely stayed at home for more than a few days. Most who knew the family assumed Daryl had been kicked out, though no one ever said it directly. The truth was more complicated. He drifted between friends' couches, sometimes vanishing for weeks. There were stints where he tried to find work, warehouse gigs, delivery runs, but nothing lasted. Employers described him as unreliable. Friends described him as paranoid. Even when he returned home, it was usually for one thing: money. The Holmes family lived in a modest 3-bedroom house in Polk County, Florida. Bernard Holmes, the father, worked long hours at a manufacturing plant. By all accounts, he tried to maintain a relationship with Daryl, calling when he could, even offering to help with job applications or rehab referrals. But those efforts rarely stuck. Patrice Holmes, the mother, had long since distanced herself emotionally from her son. She often described him as a lost cause, even to extended relatives. When asked about Daryl at gatherings, she would often sigh and change the subject. The contrast in how she treated her children was evident to anyone who spent more than 10 minutes in the house. Marcus, the oldest, had graduated with honors and was on his way to a corporate internship. The sister, whose name remained omitted in certain court records, was enrolled in nursing school during Daryl's early 20s. Both were well-liked, consistent, and according to Patrice, the reason she kept going. But Daryl? He was the warning story. He was the one they whispered about, the one relatives secretly prayed over during holidays. Patrice's frustration with him became more visible over time. There were arguments, loud ones, between them during Daryl's sporadic returns. Despite his father's efforts to mediate, it was clear where the lines were drawn. Daryl had long been painted as the one who would either end up in prison or dead before 30. He started using harder drugs in his early 20s. When his music dreams finally collapsed under the weight of unpaid studio time and lost contacts, Daryl stopped talking about a future altogether. The people who still took his calls said he sounded distant. He rarely spoke about his family except to say he didn't belong. And they never came looking. So, when police arrested Daryl Holmes in 2002 for murder, not many people were surprised. Some said they saw it coming. Others simply nodded and said, "That sounds like something he'd do." Few questioned it. Fewer defended him. But behind that arrest, behind the mugshot that circulated briefly across the local news, was something no one saw coming. Something carefully staged. And it began with the man Patrice Holmes no longer wanted in her house. Patrice and Bernard Holmes had been married for nearly 3 decades by the time things began to unravel, though those close to them admitted the decline didn't happen overnight. What started as a seemingly solid partnership gradually deteriorated into something far more corrosive. The earliest signs of fracture, according to longtime neighbors in their Polk County subdivision, showed up not in shouting matches or police visits, but in silence. Bernard, once cheerful and social, became withdrawn. Patrice, who had once attended church regularly and hosted block parties, became elusive, spending more time out than in, often dressed for destinations she never clearly explained. By 1998, Bernard had begun suspecting there was someone else. He never confronted her outright in public, but according to one coworker at the factory, Bernard once admitted that he didn't know who his wife was anymore. The distance between them grew more obvious inside the home. Separate bedrooms. Short conversations. Weeks passing without shared meals. Still, Bernard remained in the house, for the children, as he often said. Patrice, on the other hand, had already checked out. As early as 1999, her phone records would later show frequent late-night calls to numbers traced back to male acquaintances in neighboring counties. One was a former coworker from a retail job she had briefly held. Another was an ex from years prior. A third was never publicly named but was described in testimony as someone with a criminal record and a habit of asking Patrice for money. The pattern was clear: short-lived entanglements, mostly physical, and rarely kept secret for long. Bernard tried to hold the family image together. He continued paying the bills, attending school functions for Marcus and the daughter, and even reaching out to Daryl during some of his disappearances. But inside, he was unraveling. He told a close friend from work that he had once followed Patrice after she said she was going to a prayer meeting, only to find her parked outside a man's apartment for over 2 hours. He never said a word to her about it. He returned home before she did and never mentioned what he saw. The turning point came in mid-2001, when Bernard quietly consulted with an attorney about divorce. It wasn't just the cheating, it was the humiliation. His wife had begun referring to him in public as a burden. One of Patrice's friends, who later agreed to a recorded interview, admitted that Patrice once joked that she was too young to die married to a man who watched the Weather Channel all day. But when the lawyer explained how a divorce would affect the house, the finances, and more importantly, the life insurance policies tied to Bernard's pension, Patrice changed her tone. She didn't want a divorce. She wanted control. Her manipulation became more precise. To outsiders, it appeared she was trying to make things work. She started cooking again. Sat beside Bernard during one of their daughter's award nights. But those were calculated performances. Behind the scenes, her affairs continued. At least one man, Reggie, a construction worker she met through a mutual friend, began spending time in town around the same weeks Bernard started missing shifts. Patrice told him Bernard was sick, possibly depressed. She said the marriage was basically over. Reggie, who would later vanish before authorities could fully investigate him, was last seen near Patrice's house just 2 weeks before Bernard's death. By late 2001, Patrice Holmes had stopped pretending. The life insurance policy remained untouched in Bernard's name, and Patrice remained the sole beneficiary. Friends she confided in didn't see a woman struggling to hold on to a marriage. They saw someone calculating what her next chapter would look like, and how to get there without compromise. Divorce had always been off the table. As one friend later stated during an interview, she said starting over at 50 was a waste. She'd rather finish what she started her way. It was around this time that a man referred to only as Reggie in later filings began entering her life more regularly. Reggie had no public connection to the Holmes family. He didn't attend family events, he wasn't mentioned in any Christmas photos, and there were no documented joint outings. But Patrice's phone records, later subpoenaed during a separate investigation, would show that he was in near daily contact with her for nearly 4 months leading up to Bernard's death. Reggie's full identity was never confirmed, but a neighbor reported seeing a dark-colored pickup parked several houses down on multiple evenings when Bernard was working late. It was never parked directly outside the Holmes home, and Patrice would often walk down the street before getting in. Another source, a former friend of Patrice's who later cut contact, recalled being introduced to him once under a false name. This was also the period when her youngest son, Daryl, re-entered her planning, not as a child to protect, but as a pawn to sacrifice. He had been mostly absent for years, only showing up when desperate, usually broke and under the influence. Patrice knew this pattern well. She'd commented to friends before that Daryl was too far gone to fix. But now, she saw opportunity in his downfall. His unstable behavior, drug use, and history of run-ins with the law made him the perfect fall guy. She began quietly preparing the groundwork. She called him sporadically, softened her tone, even offered small amounts of money, something she hadn't done in years. These calls, brief and out of character, would later raise eyebrows, but at the time, they seemed like rare moments of a mother trying to reconnect. They were nothing of the sort. According to Daryl's later prison account, Patrice reached out in early February 2002 and mentioned that if he ever needed cash, he could stop by. He declined then, but she followed up a week later, repeating the offer. It was a small but significant change, an open door from a house that had long been shut to him. Behind that door, the real planning had already begun. Patrice started clearing space in the garage. She discarded an old freezer and rearranged the shelves to make room for something large. She also purchased heavy-duty tarp, zip ties, and industrial gloves, none of which she normally kept in the house. These items were not connected directly to any purchase receipts under her name, but similar items were later recovered at the property. It was never proven how they were obtained. Bernard remained unaware. He continued working overtime shifts and keeping to himself. What little conversation remained between him and Patrice was logistical, groceries, bills, mail. Nothing intimate. Nothing suspicious. He still hoped by some chance things might change. But Patrice was no longer considering repair. She was only calculating risk. And while Bernard Holmes went to bed every night in his own house, under his own roof, next to the same woman he married decades ago, he had no idea that someone else had already been in that house, and that Patrice Holmes had already chosen which one of them would be buried, and which one would take the blame. On the evening of March 6, 2002, Daryl Holmes arrived at his mother's house for the first time in nearly 7 months. The call came earlier that afternoon. Patrice had asked if he still needed a little help. She said she had some cash for him if he could swing by before dark. Daryl didn't ask questions. He never did when money was offered. According to later testimony, he'd been couch surfing in Lake Wales, bouncing between acquaintances, occasionally sleeping in a parked car. That week, he hadn't eaten much. He accepted the offer. When he showed up just after 7:15 p.m., the house was unusually quiet. No lights were on in the front rooms except the kitchen, and the TV, usually blasting news or game shows, was off. Patrice answered the door without her usual guarded expression. No one else was home. Her daughter lived across town, and Marcus had moved out after college. Bernard, according to Patrice's story, was working a late shift. Daryl was visibly high, which wasn't out of the ordinary. His movements were unsteady. His speech slightly slurred. A later toxicology screening confirmed he had benzodiazepines and THC in his system, typical for him at the time. Patrice didn't mention it. She invited him in and pointed him toward the kitchen. The atmosphere inside didn't match the tone of the visit. There was no tension, no condescension, none of the usual coldness Daryl had come to expect. Patrice even offered him a bottle of water and asked him to wait while she grabbed something from the garage. When she returned, she was holding a large, sealed tarp bundle, heavy, bound tight, and duct-taped multiple times over. She claimed it was trash from earlier in the week. Said someone had broken into their shed and Bernard had packed up the ruined items. According to Daryl's later statement, she asked if he could do her a favor and drop it at the town dumpster on his way out. There was no blood visible. No odor. Nothing unusual about the shape that would have raised immediate concern. The bundle was thick and slumped oddly, but Patrice's story about it being filled with soaked insulation and old shed gear didn't prompt Daryl to question it. Not in his condition. Not with the promise of cash coming. As he reached for the tarp, Patrice handed him a folded envelope. Inside were 2 $20 bills and 3 crumpled 5s. It wasn't much, but it was more than he had. She reminded him to go quickly and not to leave it by the sidewalk, saying, "Your father doesn't want that mess hanging around too long." Daryl nodded. He didn't ask where Bernard was. He didn't ask why the house was so quiet. He simply picked up the tarp, stumbled slightly as he exited through the side door, and loaded it into the back of a borrowed sedan he had driven that week. What Daryl didn't know, and what the responding officers wouldn't discover until later, was that Bernard Holmes hadn't left for a shift that evening. He hadn't left at all. The house stayed quiet after Daryl pulled away. Lights off. Curtains drawn. And then, just 4 minutes later, a 911 call came in. The woman on the line was calm at first, identifying herself as Patrice Holmes. Her voice cracked only when she reached the purpose of the call. "My son just killed my husband. He's driving away with the body. Please send someone." The dispatcher immediately escalated the situation, flagging it as a potential homicide in progress. When asked for details, Patrice claimed her son had shown up unannounced, gotten into an argument with Bernard in the back room, and then attacked him. She said she ran to the kitchen to call for help but was too late. By the time she came back down the hall, she claimed Daryl was already wrapping her husband's body in a tarp. "He told me not to scream," she said on the call. "I didn't know what to do. I didn't think he'd really do it." Her statement was shaky but coherent. She gave a description of the vehicle, the direction Daryl was headed, and even mentioned the possibility of drugs. "He's not right," she added. "He's been using again. He doesn't even know what he's doing." The Polk County Sheriff's Office responded immediately, dispatching patrol units to surrounding intersections while relaying the vehicle's description to nearby units. Less than 10 minutes later, a deputy spotted the car turning onto a side road near the old stadium lot. Dashcam footage showed the vehicle braking hard before pulling over. Daryl exited without resistance. His pupils were dilated, and his speech was slow. When asked if there was anything in the trunk, he reportedly said, "Just some junk for the dump." Inside the trunk, officers discovered the sealed tarp bundle. It was heavy, duct-taped, and slightly damp. Upon unwrapping the outer layers, deputies noted what appeared to be blood soaking through one corner. Daryl was immediately detained. He asked no questions. He didn't ask about his parents. He didn't ask why he was being handcuffed. Witnesses at the scene later said he looked more confused than afraid. By 8 p.m., the Holmes residence was surrounded by squad cars. Patrol officers secured the scene while detectives began photographing the property. Patrice stood on the front porch, arms crossed, appearing shaken but collected. A responding sergeant later noted she didn't cry, not once. She answered questions directly and without hesitation. She confirmed Bernard had been home earlier. She claimed to have seen her son push past him. "I should have called sooner," she said. News of the incident spread quickly through the neighborhood. Within an hour, 2 cousins had arrived and were standing across the street, stunned. One of them, Bernard's niece, told an officer, "That boy's always been a problem, but this?" Another neighbor, who lived 2 doors down, was interviewed the next day and said, Daryl was a walking fire. It was only a matter of time before he burned someone. No one questioned Patrice's version of events. Not then. Not with Daryl already in custody, the tarp confirmed to contain Bernard's body, and the family's history with their troubled son whispered through the community for years. Within 24 hours, Daryl Holmes was formally charged with second-degree murder and unlawful disposal of a human body. At the time, no one called it a setup. No one asked why Patrice had been so composed. No one asked how she'd known what was in the tarp. Only that her son had been the one carrying it. Daryl Holmes's trial began 4 months after his arrest, and it was anything but straightforward. From the outset, prosecutors acknowledged that the case lacked a clear motive. There were no fingerprints linking Daryl to the interior of the tarp, no signs of a violent altercation in the parts of the house police had access to, and no witnesses besides Patrice. But what the case lacked in physical evidence, it made up for in narrative, and Patrice Holmes knew how to deliver one. Her testimony was the emotional anchor of the trial. On the stand, she recounted the night her husband was killed, describing Daryl as erratic, aggressive, and desperate. But it was her additional claim that Daryl had come to the house demanding money, and that Bernard had refused him, that introduced a new layer. According to Patrice, the argument turned physical when Bernard told him to leave. She claimed Daryl flew into a rage, struck his father, and dragged the body into the garage to conceal the crime. That motive, unverified and solely sourced from Patrice, quickly became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Investigators couldn't prove it, but they also couldn't disprove it. The supposed cash Daryl was after was never found. There were no fingerprints on Bernard's wallet, no missing bank records, and no clear sign of forced entry or a struggle. Still, Patrice insisted she saw it unfold and that Daryl threatened her into silence as he prepared to dispose of the body. The defense tried to challenge her credibility, but it was an uphill battle. Forensic analysis didn't tip the scales either. Bernard's body showed signs of blunt force trauma, but the medical examiner couldn't determine the exact time of death. There were no defensive wounds, no blood spatter consistent with a struggle in any of the common areas. The garage floor had been cleaned, though not professionally. Detectives testified that while they suspected an attempt to conceal the scene, it wasn't enough to draw firm conclusions about what had actually taken place. Patrice remained consistent throughout the proceedings. Calm, grieving, and composed. She answered questions in a steady voice, rarely needing a tissue. When asked why she didn't intervene or call sooner, she said she froze. "I was scared of my own son," she told the court. The judge, in his final remarks before sentencing, acknowledged the gaps. He noted the absence of a verified motive and inconsistencies in the timeline. But he also cited the weight of circumstantial evidence and the fact that he was found in possession of Bernard's body. In the end, Daryl Holmes was found guilty of second-degree murder and unlawful handling of human remains. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison. As the courtroom emptied, no one questioned Patrice. Not the jurors. Not the public. Not even the family members who had once asked where she disappeared to during the trial recesses. But someone had seen her. And that person would eventually surface. After Daryl Holmes was convicted and transferred to a state correctional facility outside of Polk County, his absence was not mourned, it was replaced. Within weeks of the sentencing, Patrice Holmes began reordering her life, both legally and personally. The family's property was refinanced under her sole name, and she quietly filed a claim on Bernard's life insurance policy. Records show the payout exceeded $250,000. There was no contest, no public objections. Bernard had never changed the beneficiary, and Patrice had waited just long enough for the process to move without scrutiny. Around the neighborhood, she presented herself as a woman surviving tragedy. She started attending a new church 2 towns over, where few people knew her full history. Within 6 months, a new man began showing up at the house. His name never appeared in public documents related to the case, but according to relatives, he was introduced as Malcolm, a longtime friend who had been helping with yard work and errands. By the following spring, he had moved in. Meanwhile, Marcus Holmes graduated college with honors and accepted a job offer in Jacksonville. He rarely visited home but remained close to his mother, calling her weekly and attending holidays. When asked about his father or brother in later interviews, he only spoke of Bernard briefly and never mentioned Daryl at all. The daughter kept a different distance. Though she maintained communication with Patrice, she quietly withdrew from family functions. She never moved far, taking a job at a local care facility in Winter Haven, but she no longer stayed overnight at the house and stopped answering questions about her brother altogether. Friends who knew her during that time said she struggled with guilt but rarely voiced it. For Daryl, he hadn't gone silent. In prison, he began writing. At first, the journal entries were chaotic, unfiltered ramblings about the trial, confusion about his mother's behavior, and half-finished poems that hinted at betrayal. Over time, the entries sharpened. He started detailing events with dates, names, and patterns. The tone shifted from grief to clarity, and then to something colder. He wrote letters too, mostly to his sister. Some were short. Others stretched for pages. He never asked for sympathy. Only truth. None were answered. A few were returned unopened. Daryl also reached out to old friends, sending scraps of lyrics, occasional phone calls when funds allowed. Some of those conversations were later summarized by one friend who agreed to speak off-record. He was different, a friend said. No one visited him. Not once in 15 years. No one asked where his side of the story had gone. Because in Polk County, there was only one version of the truth left standing. And it belonged to the woman who now shared a bed with someone else. In June 2017, after serving 15 years of a 30-year sentence, Daryl Holmes was released from Sumter Correctional Institution on grounds of good behavior and overcrowding relief. The release wasn't widely reported, nor was there any family waiting outside the gates. The man who arrived to pick him up wasn't a relative, wasn't a lawyer, and had never testified in court. His name was Myron Fields, a mechanic from Lakeland with a quiet demeanor and a long memory. To most people, Myron was just a neighbor's younger brother. But to Daryl, he would soon become something more, an unexpected link to the life he thought had abandoned him. Myron's older brother, Andre, had been one of Patrice Holmes's former lovers. Years earlier, he had gotten involved with her during the final year of her marriage to Bernard. At the time, Patrice painted herself as a victim, unhappy, neglected, and trapped. Andre believed her. He gave her money, helped her with personal expenses, and even, according to Myron, took out a short-term loan in her name to help her restart her life. But once the funds dried up, so did the relationship. Patrice ghosted Andre without explanation. Weeks later, she moved on with another man. Andre lost everything trying to repay what he'd borrowed and spiraled into depression. He was later found unresponsive in a motel room in 2005. The cause of death was ruled accidental overdose. The family never publicly linked Patrice to his death, but Myron never forgot her name. When he heard Daryl was being released, Myron reached out quietly through someone at the prison, a cousin who worked there part-time. The offer was simple, a place to stay, no questions asked. Daryl accepted. He had nowhere else to go. The first few nights were quiet. Daryl barely spoke, ate little, and spent most of his time staring out the window. But as the days passed, conversations deepened. Myron asked what really happened. Daryl told him everything. How his mother called him that night, the sealed tarp, the cash, the confusion, and the 911 call that followed. Myron didn't blink. Instead, he told Daryl what happened to Andre. The overlap in their stories was jarring. Both men had been used. Both discarded. Both left holding pieces of Patrice's twisted history. Myron still had receipts, literally. Loan documents, signed withdrawal slips, even old voicemails Patrice left on Andre's answering machine. "You'd be amazed what people forget to erase," he said. Daryl's interest shifted from confusion to calculation. Not revenge, not yet, but a quiet pursuit of clarity. He asked questions he never had the chance to ask in court. Why no one questioned Patrice's version? Why her house was never fully searched? Why she knew the weight of a tarp she supposedly never touched? Myron didn't have all the answers. But he had something else. He had been watching Patrice. For years. Not obsessively, but enough to track the highlights. Her new home, her routines, the fact that Malcolm still lived with her. The barbecues she hosted every summer. The family gatherings. The way she'd publicly rebuilt a life that Daryl wasn't even allowed to exist in. Daryl never said the word revenge. But after one late-night conversation on Myron's back porch, he said something that made the next step clear. "She erased me. Let's see if she remembers how I got here in the first place." From the outside, Patrice Holmes appeared to have rebuilt her life into something stable, almost enviable. The home she now occupied in the outskirts of Bardo, a quieter part of Polk County, was modest but well kept. Malcolm, the man she'd taken in after Bernard's death, still lived with her. He worked as a mid-level logistics coordinator, kept to himself, and according to neighbors, mowed the lawn religiously every Saturday. Patrice, now in her early 60s, was described by neighbors as polite, church-going, and guarded. Few knew the history behind her last name. But Myron knew. And with Daryl now living in the guest room of his small duplex on the other side of town, the two began working quietly, observing her movements, noting patterns, and collecting details. It wasn't formal surveillance, but it was intentional. Myron followed her to grocery stores, tracked which nights Malcolm's car stayed parked, and kept tabs on visits from Marcus and Daryl's sister. One detail caught Daryl's attention immediately. Patrice still hosted family events. Birthdays. Graduations. Summer holidays. One in particular stood out, the annual late July barbecue. It was a tradition Bernard had started when the kids were young, something simple in the backyard with a folding table, paper plates, and music playing low through the kitchen window. Patrice had carried it on. And according to Myron's latest sighting, this year's barbecue was already being planned. Saturday, July 29, 2017, started like any other hot Florida summer day, humid, cloudless, and quiet. By noon, the scent of charcoal and seasoned meat drifted through the backyard of Patrice Holmes's home in Bardo. Folding tables lined with aluminum pans, red Solo cups, and 2 liters of soda sat beneath a pop-up canopy in the back. Malcolm manned the grill. Patrice moved between the kitchen and patio with practiced ease. To everyone present, it felt like any other family gathering. Marcus had arrived that morning, arms full of paper towels, hamburger buns, and a Bluetooth speaker. Patrice greeted him with her usual pride, asking about his work, his health, and the apartment in Jacksonville. She wore a yellow dress and wedge sandals, her makeup light, her smile practiced. Her daughter showed up around 2:30 p.m., alone, bringing a store-bought pie and offering a quiet hug instead of conversation. She stayed on the fringe of the group, rarely breaking eye contact with her mother. Guests filtered in, 2 cousins, Malcolm's niece, and a neighbor from down the road. It wasn't a large event, just under a dozen people in total, but the mood was light. Patrice kept the music low, served everyone herself, and took the time to thank each person for coming. Around 3:45 p.m., with plates full and chairs gathered around the shade, she raised her cup to give a short toast. She thanked God for life. Thanked Malcolm for holding her up through difficult years. And she ended by saying, "Family is everything. Always has been." No one noticed him sneaking in. Daryl. He wore jeans, a plain shirt, and a ball cap pulled low over his face. He entered through the narrow alley beside the property, stepped over a pile of old fencing, and slipped behind a hedge that lined the backyard's far corner. Myron was parked 2 streets over in a silver sedan with the engine running and the air conditioner off. He didn't get out. He didn't look back. Daryl waited there for several minutes, watching. There was no hesitation, no adrenaline, no last-minute doubt. He wasn't looking to speak. He wasn't there to make anyone understand. From behind the hedge, he could see Patrice laughing as she leaned against Malcolm's shoulder. Marcus tossing a water bottle to a cousin. His sister standing stiffly, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the grass. No one saw him coming. No one even knew he was there. But Daryl knew exactly who he came for. And who he wouldn't touch. At 4:12 p.m., a burst of screams shattered the calm of what had, until then, been a quiet summer barbecue in the backyard of Patrice Holmes's home. The first shot came without warning. Patrice was standing near the picnic table, holding a plate of ribs, mid-laugh. The bullet struck her in the upper back. She collapsed instantly. Her body landed face first across a plastic chair, knocking it over as silence turned into panic. The second shot followed within seconds. Malcolm, who had just stepped toward the grill with a spatula in hand, turned in the direction of the sound. The round caught him near the collarbone. He dropped where he stood, gasping for air that wouldn't come. There was no time for anyone to react. No shouting. No running. Just confusion, followed by the realization that something irreversible had begun. Marcus Holmes was standing across the yard, holding a cup of soda and a phone. The third shot didn't come from a distance. Daryl had crossed the yard by then, face to face, eyes locked in. Neighbors later said they heard yelling after the second shot, but no one could make out the words. There were no witnesses close enough to see what was said between the two brothers. What is confirmed is that Daryl raised the gun to Marcus's chest and fired once. Marcus fell backward into the grass, his phone sliding across the patio pavers. The only person Daryl didn't aim at was his sister. She had frozen behind the patio umbrella, one hand on her pie dish, the other covering her mouth. As he approached her, she didn't scream. She didn't run. And he didn't speak, at first. He just looked at her. Then handed her the phone Marcus had dropped. His voice, according to her later statement, was low but firm. "Call the police. Tell them it was me." Then he walked out. Past the grill. Past the tipped-over table. Through the same alley where he had slipped in, disappearing before sirens ever reached the street. She did exactly what he said. The 911 call came in at 4:17 p.m. The voice on the other end was clear, terrified, and trying not to cry. "My brother just shot my mom, and my brother, and Malcolm." The dispatcher asked where the shooter was. She answered with 3 words, "He walked away." Police arrived within 6 minutes. 2 victims, Patrice and Malcolm, were pronounced dead at the scene. Marcus was transported to the emergency room but declared deceased shortly after arrival. The backyard was sealed off. Crime scene tape stretched across the fence. Neighbors lined the street, phones out, trying to make sense of the chaos. The daughter sat on the porch steps, her hands still shaking. And for the first time since Daryl's arrest in 2002, she told the police exactly what had never been asked before. Daryl Holmes was arrested just after midnight, roughly 8 hours after the shooting. Authorities tracked him to a rundown motel on the edge of Winter Haven, less than 20 miles from the crime scene. He didn't resist. When officers entered the room, he was sitting on the bed, fully dressed, with his shoes still on. The lights were off. No weapon was found in the room, but a small bag containing a phone charger, travel toothbrush, and a change of clothes lay untouched by the sink. He offered no explanation, made no statements, and asked for no attorney. He simply said, "You got me," and put out his wrists. Myron Fields, the man who had picked Daryl up from prison and provided shelter, was nowhere to be found. His car was later discovered abandoned behind a gas station in Lake Alfred. Neighbors near his duplex reported seeing him pack a duffel bag earlier that evening. As of that week, he had not returned to his job and hadn't contacted family. A warrant was issued, but Myron remained out of reach. As detectives worked through the interviews, Daryl's sister became the central voice in the reconstruction. Her statement was detailed and consistent. She confirmed Daryl told her to call 911 and did not threaten her. She also admitted, for the first time, that she had begun questioning the circumstances of Bernard Holmes's death years earlier, especially after reconnecting with a childhood neighbor who brought up the inconsistencies. It was her testimony that triggered a deeper look into Patrice's financial history. Within 72 hours, investigators retrieved archived banking records, loan documents, and policy disbursements tied to Bernard's death. The findings confirmed that Patrice had received the full life insurance payout months after the homicide and had used the funds, in part, to secure her new residence and later refinance it in her name. There were also wire transfers made to unknown individuals, and one flagged transaction matching the routing number of a bank account linked to a man who was never formally interviewed in the original investigation, believed to be the individual later referred to in court as Reggie. The picture that began to emerge was more complex than the narrative that had sent Daryl to prison years earlier. But complexity didn't change the present. 3 people were dead. 1 man was in custody, and another had vanished. The investigators' focus now shifted to the past, because buried beneath the fresh crime scene was a case that had never truly been solved. In the weeks following the shooting, investigators began reviewing the life of Patrice Holmes through a different lens. No longer seen solely as the grieving widow from 2002, she was now at the center of a reinvestigation that asked a question no one had seriously considered before. What if Daryl Holmes hadn't been the villain in his family's story, but the scapegoat? Digging into Patrice's past revealed a pattern of calculated manipulation, particularly with men. Over a span of nearly 2 decades, she had cycled through a string of romantic relationships, each following a nearly identical trajectory: emotional dependency, financial involvement, and sudden disappearance. One former boyfriend, who agreed to a posthumous deposition in a separate civil matter years prior, described her as sweet at first until you started asking questions. He said she borrowed money for what she called family emergencies, but never repaid him. When he pressed her, she blocked his number and moved without notice. Another man, briefly involved with her during the years following Bernard's death, claimed Patrice falsely told him her husband had died in a robbery and that her son had disappeared. She painted herself as a survivor, he told detectives. But she was always vague. Something didn't add up. Financial records further backed these testimonies. Between 2003 and 2009, Patrice had taken out multiple personal loans, often with co-signers who never recovered their money. At least 2 men listed on those documents had previously been involved with her. One of them, later identified as Andre Fields, the older brother of Myron, had transferred nearly $18,000 to Patrice over the course of 8 months. Bank statements obtained during the shooting investigation showed she withdrew most of it in cash installments under $500, avoiding attention from the IRS. When Andre's financial troubles mounted and he confronted her, she disappeared from his life entirely. He died 2 years later. The cause was officially ruled an overdose. No connection to Patrice was ever pursued at the time. Her portrayal of Daryl in court had painted him as an unhinged, violent addict. But the deeper investigators looked, the more inconsistencies emerged. Daryl had indeed struggled. With drugs, with employment, with direction. But much of his criminal record prior to 2002 consisted of low-level misdemeanors, disorderly conduct, possession, trespassing, none violent, and none involving weapons. It became clear that Patrice had spent years controlling the family narrative: who was worthy, who was dangerous, who was disposable. Her daughter, now cooperating fully with the investigation, admitted to feeling pressured to agree with the stories Patrice told over the years. She recalled how any attempt to ask questions about Bernard's death or Daryl's arrest was met with stone-cold silence or redirected blame. The more investigators uncovered, the harder it became to ignore the central question. Was Daryl Holmes truly the product of his own failures, or the result of a mother who always needed someone to take the fall? In August 2017, Daryl Holmes was formally charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of his mother Patrice Holmes, his brother Marcus, and Malcolm Hargrove. The charges also included unlawful possession of a firearm by a felon and aggravated assault. The court proceedings, which began that fall, reopened wounds that had long been buried, but never properly healed. The prosecution made no attempt to deny Daryl's troubled past or the brutality of the shooting. Their argument was direct: 3 people were dead, and Daryl Holmes pulled the trigger. The defense, however, painted a different picture, one that didn't deny the killings but placed them in the context of betrayal, psychological deterioration, and a miscarriage of justice that began 15 years earlier. Daryl's attorney focused on the original 2002 conviction, reintroducing evidence that had once been considered circumstantial: his mother's testimony, the missing cash, and the absence of any forensic proof tying him to the actual act of murder. The defense claimed that Daryl had been framed by Patrice in order to collect life insurance money and eliminate her husband. They argued that his mental and emotional descent in prison, compounded by years of abandonment and unanswered questions, led to a psychological collapse that culminated in the triple homicide. To support their case, the defense called a forensic psychologist who had conducted multiple interviews with Daryl. The expert testified that Daryl exhibited signs of complex PTSD, paranoia, and emotional disassociation consistent with long-term psychological trauma. According to the report, Daryl's journals revealed a man grappling with the slow realization that he had been manipulated by the one person he had still tried to impress, even after years of neglect. Still, the prosecution challenged whether any of that could justify what took place at the barbecue. They called attention to the premeditation, the surveillance, the timing, and the fact that Daryl had waited for the exact moment when all 3 victims were most vulnerable. They highlighted the deliberate nature of each shot. They reminded the jury that he had brought a loaded weapon into a family gathering and made the decision to kill not in the heat of passion, but after 15 years of planning. Daryl's sister, under oath, spoke to both sides of her brother. She acknowledged his pain and the betrayal he'd endured, but she didn't excuse his actions. She said, "I believe him about what happened back then. But that didn't have to end this way." The courtroom remained tense throughout the closing arguments. No one cried. There were no outbursts. Just silence, sharpened by the weight of years that could never be recovered. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Their task was not just to weigh guilt, but to determine whether motive and mental trauma could in any way mitigate premeditated violence. The verdict was unanimous. And by the time it was read, Daryl never once looked away from the bench. On October 4, 2017, Daryl Holmes was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He showed no reaction as the sentence was handed down. No appeals were filed. No words were spoken in court on his behalf. He simply nodded once, stood, and allowed the bailiff to escort him out. The trial ended without fanfare. No family members stood in the gallery. No reporters gathered outside. It was the quiet close to a case that had long since burned through its final threads of reconciliation. The courtroom emptied within minutes. The judge, in his final remarks, called it one of the most emotionally tangled cases he had presided over in years. Daryl's defense team had done what they could, but the facts remained fixed. 3 people were dead, and there was no legal path forward that could unravel the brutality of what had happened that day. While the courtroom acknowledged the possibility that Daryl had been wrongly convicted in 2002, it was equally clear that the barbecue killings were a deliberate act. Premeditated, cold, and permanent. Myron Fields, the man believed to have helped Daryl plan the surveillance and potentially aided in the escape that day, was never located. The Holmes family home in Bardo was sold within 2 months of the sentencing. The new owners, unaware of its full history at the time, requested renovations before moving in. The backyard grill was removed. The privacy hedge was cut down. Daryl's sister, now the only surviving member of the immediate family, moved out of Florida shortly after the sale. She changed her name legally and transferred her nursing license to another state. According to sources, she left behind no forwarding address and asked former coworkers not to disclose her location. She has not spoken publicly since the trial ended. In closed-door debriefings, prosecutors and investigators who worked both the original case and the reopened files gave quiet acknowledgement to one conclusion: the truth had never belonged to one version of events. It had been split, buried, and twisted by years of silence and manipulation. For some, the 2002 case had been a procedural failure, one where motive was assumed, not proven. For others, it was a story about the limits of the justice system's reach, especially when the lies start inside the home. But among those who studied the case closely, the final assessment was blunt. This was never about rage. It was about betrayal. A son who spent half his life paying for a lie. And a mother who built her freedom on the bones of her husband. Until the house she built turned to ash.